Okay. Hey everyone, welcome to week 5 of the Bio and Med Bootcamp. So today we're going to be talking about the heart circulatory system and some of the diseases that can occur. So I just want to start up the lesson with a quick fun fact. If you stretched out all your blood vessels end to end, they would be able to circle the earth at least twice. Our blood vessels are just one component of the cardiovascular system, which is the topic for today. So a quick table of contents for what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start off with a quick introduction to the cardiovascular system. Then we're going to talk about blood vessels and circulation, heart anatomy and function, and then diseases. To begin, I'm going to quickly introduce the cardiovascular system to you guys. It's also known as the circulatory system, so you might be familiar with either of those terms. So basically, the cardiovascular system delivers oxygen, nutrients, and other substances to the body's cells and organs, and it also removes waste in the blood. So there are two main components of the cardiovascular system, the heart and the blood vessels. The heart is a muscular pump that circulates blood throughout the body, and the blood vessels are the transportation network for blood to circulate through the body. So what this picture is just showing, it's showing the arteries and veins, which are the blood vessels, and it's showing the heart. Okay, so now we're going to go over each of the components of the cardiovascular system, and we're going to start off by talking about blood vessels and circulation. So just a quick question, does anyone know the difference between arteries and veins? And you can just unmute and answer.
Um, Arteries, I think they carry oxygenated blood while veins carry deoxygenated blood mostly.
Yes, that's perfect. That's exactly the difference. So there's three types of blood vessels, arteries, veins, and capillaries. And as you said, the arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart, and the veins carry deoxygenated blood toward the heart from the tissues. And just like easy way to remember is just arteries away. They both start with A. So that's just a way to remember it. And then we have a third type of blood vessel called capillaries, and they're basically tiny vessels that facilitate gas and nutrient exchange. And this is just showing that these are the arteries carrying oxygenated blood, these are the veins that carry deoxygenated blood, and the capillaries facilitate gas and nutrient exchange. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little more about the difference between arteries and veins, and this is a diagram that shows this really nicely. So the arteries and veins, one of their main differences is that the blood pressure in arteries is high and the blood pressure in veins is low. So because the the blood pressure in arteries is high, they need to have strong elastic walls. So that's why the arteries have thicker walls than the veins. And since blood pressure is low in the veins, then that means that they have thinner walls. So as you can see, the picture is just showing that the arteries carry blood away from the heart. They carry oxygen-rich blood to the tissues. This goes to the arterioles, to the tissue capillaries, and then the venules. And then from the venules, the veins are going to carry oxygenated poor blood from tissues. And because it's oxygen poor blood, like there's no oxygen, that means that the blood pressure is low, which is why veins have thinner walls. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the two types of circulation, pulmonary versus systemic. So systemic circulation delivers blood from the heart to the rest of the body, and pulmonary circulation moves blood between the heart and the lungs. So as you can see in this picture, systemic circulation is right here in the bottom half, and it's between the heart and the rest of the body because it's carrying blood from the heart to like the tissues in the body. And then pulmonary circulation is just between the heart and the lungs. So this is where the blood's going to pick up oxygen and where the blood is going to lose oxygen. While in systemic circulation, the blood loses oxygen to the cells and it picks up carbon dioxide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the second component of the cardiovascular system. We're going to talk about heart anatomy and function. So first, we're going to talk about the basic anatomy of the heart. So there are two chambers of the heart. There are two atrium and two ventricles. The atrium, they receive blood, while the ventricles pump blood out. So as you can see in this picture, this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle, and then this is the right atrium, and this is the left atrium. So when you're looking at diagrams, an easy way to remember is that it would be backwards. So right is actually left, and then left is actually right. So that's just the way to remember it. And then in addition to the chambers of the heart, there are also three layers of the heart. We have the endocardium, the myocardium, and the epicardium. So does anyone want to explain the difference between the three layers of the heart, if you know?
I'm not really sure, but I think the endocardium is the inside layer.
Yes.
The myocardium is, I think, the middle layer, while the epicardium is the outermost layer.
Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, so the endocardium, it's a thin inner lining of the heart's chambers and valves, and it's going to contain vessels and nerves, and it provides a smooth surface to reduce friction as blood flows through the heart. You can see that endocardium here, and you can see like all the blood vessels and nerves in the picture. And then, as you said, the myocardium is a middle layer of muscle, and it's a thick layer of muscle that contracts and relaxes to pump blood throughout the body. And the myocardium, as you can see in the picture, is made up of cardiac muscle cells because it needs to pump blood throughout the body. And then finally, we have the epicardium, which is a protective outer layer that contains blood vessels, and it has a thin, transparent surface and an inner layer of areolar connective tissue with fat deposits. So that's what you're seeing here. So basically, it works to protect the heart as it's an outer layer. And the heart is also surrounded by the pericardium, which is a sac made of thin layers of tissue that holds the heart in place and protects it. And a small amount of fluid between the layers of the pericardium and the heart reduces friction as the heart beats. So now we're going to talk about the major valves of the heart. The heart's valves are very important because they open and close to ensure blood moves in the correct direction and at the right time. They also prevent blood from flowing backwards because it's very important that the valves are just a one-way door for blood because blood can't come back to where it came from, or this is going to cause damage to the heart. So there's four major valves of the heart. We have the tricuspid valve, which is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. We have the pulmonary valve, which is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. And we have the mitral valve, which is between the left atrium and left ventricle. And then the aortic valve, which is between the left atrium and aorta. And we're going to talk a little bit more about like the pathway of the heart so you understand how blood flows throughout the heart. So first off, just like a quick overview of the pathway of blood through the heart, deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium, it flows to the right ventricle and is pumped in the lungs, and then oxygenated blood returns to the left atrium, and it flows to the left ventricle and is pumped to the body. So as you can see in this diagram, the blood first enters the heart through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and this is going to enter the right atrium, and the blood is going to travel from the right atrium to the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. Then it's going to go through the pulmonary valve from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery in the lungs. And this is going to go to the lung capillaries where we see oxygen exchange happening. So CO2 is exhaled and oxygen is inhaled. And then this is where the blood becomes oxygenated. So the oxygenated blood will go to the pulmonary vein, which is going to leave the lungs and enter the heart through the left atrium. And from the left atrium to the left ventricle, the blood is going to go through the mitral valve. And then finally, the blood is going to go through the aortic valve to the aorta. And then from the aorta, the blood is going to be pumped to all parts of the body. So I think this is a nice diagram that shows the pathway of blood through the heart. Okay, so now that we talked a bit about the heart and its anatomy, now we're going to talk about the heartbeat. So there's two phases of the heartbeat. We have diastole, which is relaxation, and this is where the chamber is filled with blood. And then we have systole, which is contraction, and this is where blood is pumped out. So you can see in this picture that the heart is relaxed as the chambers fill with blood. And then in this one, the heart is contracting and it's working to pump blood out. So you can see the differences between these two pictures. And then another important thing that you can use to tell whether there's any disease or damages with the heart is through heart sounds. So the closure of the valves is associated with sounds lub dub, lub dub. So lub is the closure of the tricuspid and mitral valves at the beginning of systole, and dub is the closure of the aortic and pulmonary valves at the end of systole. So every time the tricuspid and mitral valves and the aortic and pulmonary valves close, you need to hear the lub dub, lub dub. And that's how you know if the heart is working well. But sometimes there's things called murmurs, and this is an abnormal heart sound caused by improper valve closure. So if you hear any murmurs, then you'll know that there's an issue with the heart that needs to be looked at.
We're going to talk a bit about the diseases that can occur in the heart. It's very important to learn about heart disease as it's the leading cause of death globally. So there are 6 principal mechanisms that can indicate damage or disease in the heart: pump failure, obstruction to flow, regurgitant flow, shunted flow, disorders of cardiac conduction, and rupture of heart or major vessel. We're going to go over each of these mechanisms a little. First, we have pump failure. Pump failure is basically the heart's inability to contract effectively and pump enough blood to meet the body's needs. This leads to an inadequate amount of blood flow and subsequently oxygen to the tissues. One example of pump failure would be heart failure, where one or both of the heart's ventricles fail to pump effectively. Another example of pump failure is a heart attack, where damaged cardiac muscle reduces the heart's pumping capabilities. And then this is a picture showing the normal heart compared to heart failure. And you can see in the normal heart, the heart muscle is able to effectively pump blood out of the left ventricle, but in the damaged heart, the heart muscle is weakened, which causes the heart to not be able to pump enough blood. The second mechanism is obstruction to flow, which is where there are physical barriers that are obstructing blood flow. This results in an increased workload on the heart or hypertrophy of the cardiac muscle. Hypertrophy is when the heart muscle thickens and becomes enlarged. An example of obstruction to flow would be atherosclerosis, which is when the arteries narrow due to plaque buildup. And then you can see in this picture, it's showing a normal blood vessel as compared to one that's being obstructed. So you can see in the normal blood vessel, there's no plaque buildup, so the blood is able to flow easily. But in this picture, there's cholesterol buildup, which is a specific type of plaque buildup, and this is impeding the blood flow and it's leading to less blood flow. So the third mechanism is regurgitant flow, which is backward flow of the blood due to faulty valves. This causes the heart to work harder because it has to pump the same blood repeatedly. Some examples of this is if blood leaks back into the left atrium due to issues with the mitral valve, or if blood flows back into the left ventricle due to issues with the aortic valve. And this picture is showing aortic valve regurgitation, which is when the aortic valve fails to close, allowing blood to leak backward. So blood is flowing back into the left ventricle. Fourth, we have shunted flow. This is where there are abnormal blood flow paths that flow between the chambers of the heart where they're not supposed to. An example of this is if abnormal blood flow causes oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood to mix together. We'll talk more about this when we get into the specific diseases. So this picture is showing a normal heart, and then it's showing a specific type of shunted flow called tetralogy of Fallot. And we're going to talk about this more later. Okay, so fifth, we have disorders of cardiac conduction. This is where there are abnormalities in the electrical signaling pathways that control heart rhythm and contractions. This results in inefficient pumping of blood due to uncoordinated contractions. An example of this would be arrhythmias or irregular heartbeats. And as you can see in the picture, there's abnormalities in the electrical signaling pathways, so this is messing up the pumping of the blood. And finally, our sixth mechanism is rupture of the heart or major vessel. As the name implies, this is when cardiac muscle or major blood vessels rupture or tear, which leads to significant blood loss. And you can see this picture is showing blood vessels in the brain, and it's showing how there's blockage in the blood vessel, and because of the blockage, it causes a rupture. Okay, so those were the six principal mechanisms that indicate damage or disease in the heart. Keeping those in mind, we're now going to talk about a few specific heart diseases. Also, your homework for this week will be to find pictures of the diseases I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to be giving a quick overview, and you guys will be finding pictures of the diseases so you can work while I'm talking. I think it's very helpful to look at pictures in order to understand the differences between the diseases. Okay, so the first category of disease we're going to be talking about is heart failure. Heart failure occurs when the heart is unable to pump enough blood to meet the body's needs. It can affect either the left or right side of the heart. Left-sided heart failure is the most common form of heart failure, and it often progresses to involve the right side of the heart. So, what's the difference between left-sided and right-sided? Left-sided heart failure occurs when the left ventricle fails to pump blood efficiently, which leads to a backup of blood in the lungs, resulting in the inability to pump blood to the body. So remember that left-sided involves the left ventricle, and this is specifically talking about pulmonary congestion. So left-sided heart failure can happen in two ways. Number one, the left ventricle loses its ability to contract effectively, or number two, the left ventricle becomes stiff and cannot relax properly. Some symptoms of left-sided heart failure would be difficulty breathing, coughing with sputum, fatigue, and crackles in breathing. So next, right-sided heart failure occurs when the right ventricle fails to pump blood efficiently, which leads to a backup of blood in systemic circulation, resulting in an inability to pump blood to the lungs. Symptoms of right-sided heart failure include peripheral edema. So if there's swelling in the ankles, feet, and sometimes the abdomen, then that would be a sign of right-sided heart failure. So now we're going to move on to congenital heart disease. Congenital heart disease is a birth defect that affects the structure of the heart, preventing blood from flowing normally. So there are two main subcategories of congenital heart disease, left to right shunts and right to left shunts, which we briefly mentioned when talking about the six principal mechanisms. So in left to right shunts, oxygenated blood from systemic circulation, left side of the heart, is abnormally directed to the pulmonary circulation, right side of the heart. So blood is being directed from the left to the right side, which is why it's called left to right shunts. And this is going to result in an increased workload on the right side of the heart and the pulmonary vessels. There are three common types of left to right shunts: atrial septal defect, ventricular septal defect, and patent ductus arteriosus. Atrial septal defect is when there's a hole between the atria. Ventricular septal defect is when there's a hole between the ventricle. Patent ductus arteriosus is when the ductus arteriosus fails to close after birth, resulting in a persistent opening between the aorta and pulmonary artery. In right to left shunts, deoxygenated blood bypasses the lungs and is pumped directly into systemic circulation, resulting in cyanosis, which is a bluish discoloration of the skin due to lack of oxygen in the blood. There are three common types of right to left shunts: tetralogy of Fallot, transposition of the great arteries, and truncus arteriosus. Tetralogy of Fallot occurs when there are four key abnormalities. Number one, ventricular septal defect, or a hole in the wall that separates the ventricles. Number two, pulmonary stenosis, which is when the pulmonary valve is narrowed. Number three, overriding aorta. Aorta receives blood from both the left and right ventricles. And number four, right ventricle hypertrophy. The right ventricle thickens. So when all four of these things take place, then we have tetralogy of Fallot. Next, the second type of right to left shunt is transposition of the great arteries, where the aorta and pulmonary artery are swapped. So the aorta originally arises from the left ventricle, and the pulmonary artery originally arises from the right ventricle. But in transposition of the great arteries, the aorta arises from the right ventricle, and the pulmonary artery arises from the left ventricle. So the two locations are swapped. And truncus arteriosus is when the aorta and pulmonary artery don't separate properly. So just a quick summary. A trick to remember the difference between the two is that left to right shunts involve holes in the structures of the heart, while right to left shunts result in cyanosis, or bluish discoloration of the skin. So the final type of heart disease we're going to look over is ischemic heart disease, or also known as coronary artery disease. This is when blood flow to the heart muscle is reduced, typically due to atherosclerosis in the coronary arteries, which is when plaque builds up inside the arteries. This results in reduced oxygen delivered, leading to ischemia or insufficient oxygen supply. There are three common types of ischemic heart disease: angina pectoris, myocardial infarction or heart attack, and chronic conditions. Angina pectoris is chest pain or discomfort that occurs when the heart muscle doesn't receive enough blood and oxygen. Myocardial infarction or heart attack is when blood flow to a portion of the myocardium is blocked and it doesn't receive enough blood, resulting in irreversible muscle damage. Chronic ischemic heart disease is when there is long-term myocardial ischemia, which leads to progressive heart dysfunction. Okay, so that's all of the lecture for today. Thank you so much for listening. So the homework for this week is to find pictures of the diseases I talked about today and make sure you understand the differences between the types of heart disease. You guys can watch the recording of this if you need to, and if it helps, you can work while I'm talking. And once again, I think this assignment is very important because the pictures will really help you understand the differences between the diseases. So, as a quick summary, the three main categories of diseases we talked about today are heart failure, congenital heart disease, and ischemic heart disease. And within each of those three categories, there's several subcategories for each of them, so make sure that you find pictures for all of the diseases mentioned. Thank you so much for coming to this week, and I hope you learned something and I hope you liked it.